Hello, everybody. My name is Kunta Singh, and today I'm going to present my psychology presentation project in front of all of you. Before we start, a bit about me. My name, Gunta Singh. Age, I'm 19 years old. Gender, I'm male. So you see, this About Me page is kind of like a non-experimental research description of subject, kind of. Studying Astute of Science degree here in Capilano University, and the subject today is Psychology 100. A bit about my background. My first language is Punjabi. My second one is English. I am an international student from India. I'm from Punjab, a state in northern India. Well, that should be it about me. And now let's start with the project. Aim of the project. The presentation's aim is to compare experimental and non-experimental research methodologies using examples from a specific research area. Well, the research area I chose is reinforcement in operant conditioning. And before we get in the research area, let's talk about research types: experimental research and non-experimental research. For example, correlational research. If we talk about experimental research, we have to say that it is a form of study that uses a scientific technique to manipulate one or more independent variables in the research subject and then measure the effect of the manipulation on the subject. This research is well known for allowing manipulation of independent variables. That's the main essence of experimental research. Researchers in experimental research try to control extraneous variables by keeping them constant. Experimental research allows to draw conclusions about causal relationships among variables. Now we talk about non-experimental research. This type of research can be defined as a study in which no control on the independent variable is manipulated. Researchers in the study or research measure change in variables without any manipulation. That's the main essence. There is no manipulation of independent variable. So in this research, there is no question regarding a causal relationship between two variables, and manipulating the independent variable is difficult. So non-experimental research allows for the testing and prediction of expected relationships between and among variables. That's it. No manipulation of independent variables. Now let's go into operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a learning method popularized by B.F. Skinner, in which the consequences of a response determine the likelihood that a behavior will be repeated. Using operant conditioning, behavior that is reinforced, that is rewarded, is more likely to be repeated, whereas behavior that is punished is less likely to occur. Operant conditioning involves learning through the consequences of behavior. B.F. Skinner is regarded as the father of operant conditioning. I'm not going to pronounce his full name. That's way too tough. Now, let's go into types of responses. Skinner identified two types of responses that follow a behavior: reinforcement and punishment. Any event that strengthens or increases the likelihood of a behavior can be called reinforcement. On the other hand, any event that weakens or decreases the likelihood of behavior is a punishment. And also now, types of reinforcers. Positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement strengthens the response by presenting something pleasant after the response. For example, giving a student a prize after he gets an A on a test. Negative reinforcement strengthens the response by reducing or removing something unpleasant. For example, doing seat belts to eliminate the annoying TTT warning sounds in the car. That's a kind of negative reinforcement. It does like forces you to do the thing, but it's like eliminating something unpleasant. Now, types of punishers. Positive punishment weakens a response by presenting something unpleasant after the response, like grounding a child after he fights his friend. Negative punishment weakens a response by reducing or removing something pleasant. For example, like taking away the smartphone after a teenager gets less marks on his test or fails his test. Now, let's talk about the real deal here, non-experimental research. And the source we used for this research is from B.J. Bushman, Boom Headshot. It's about games, video games, the effect of violent video games on people. Overview of the research. The study aimed to examine both the short-term experimental effects and long-term correlational effects of exposure to violent shooting video games on headshots obtained after firing an actual gun at a life-sized human-shaped mannequin after the game was turned off. To measure short-term effects, participants were randomly allocated to play an FPS game that awards headshots, a non-violent shooting game that punishes headshots but rewards other shots, or a non-violent non-shooting game. The number of violent shooting video game participants identified among their 3 favorite video games was used to calculate long-term exposure to violent shooting video games. Several control variables were introduced. Previous research has shown that males are more likely than females to own and use guns, and the studies mentioned males have more positive attitude towards guns than females, and the studies mentioned. And males are more likely than females to play and enjoy violent video games, and a study from Hartman, Moller, and Cross is mentioned. Individual differences in gun ownership, use, and views were also controlled for since participants fired a realistic firearm. The total number of hits to the mannequin, which controls her ability in shooting a realistic firearm, was the last control variable. Now let's talk about the hypotheses. They had 3 hypotheses. Number 1, those who played a first-person shooter FPS game were anticipated to hit the mannequin's head more frequently than the participants who played either the non-violent game or the non-violent non-shooting game. This was the major hypothesis because FPS game utilized in the experiment immediately rewarded for the headshots. Number 2, participants in the non-violent shooting game were predicted to strike the mannequin's torso more frequently than participants in the non-violent and non-shooting game, like Mario, because the non-violent shooting game rewarded other shots, not the headshots. Hypothesis 3, the amount of violent shooting games participants indicated as one of their 3 favorite video games and impacts to the mannequin's head were predicted to have a positive correlation. So now let's see the research design and the data. Participants, 287 university students with a 51% males took part in the study as a part of course requirement. The procedure, participants after their consent reported their age and gender. They also reported 3 measures about guns. Firstly, number of guns ever owned was reported. Secondly, participants reported the number of times they shot a gun in real life. Third, they completed attitude towards guns scale. Participants then listed their 3 favorite video games, which was used to measure individual preference for violent video games. Participants next were assigned to 3 groups of violent FPS games, non-violent shooting game, and non-violent non-shooting games. Participants were encouraged to score as many points as possible and were then allowed to play for 20 minutes only. Immediately after the game, participants were asked to shoot a mannequin with 16 Velcro bullets without telling them where to aim. Afterwards, experimenter took a digital photo of the mannequin to calculate the number of hits and the position where the shots were fired. And the results and conclusions from this study were the hits to the mannequin head. Let's see that. Participants who played the violent FPS game had 26% more headshots than the participants who played other games, which supports hypothesis 1. Men hit mannequins' head more often than women, which supports hypothesis 3. Hits to mannequin torso. Number of torso shots did not differ between participants who played the games other than the violent FPS games. The other two types, they didn't differ. There was a negative relationship between number of violent shooting games participants listed among their 3 shared video games and number of torso shots. Women hit torso shots more often than men. Correlational results. There is a significant positive correlation between the number of violent shooting games listed and number of mannequin headshots, which supports hypothesis 3, similar to previous research from Hartman in 2015. Males had more preference for violent shooting games than females, according to research from these guys in 2018, Lapierre and Ferrar. I hope I pronounced them right. Preference for violent shooting games was positively correlated with attitude towards guns. The number of violent shooting games listed was positively correlated with the number of guns owned. And the conclusion we reached from that, this research found that playing an FPS game that awards headshots for only 20 minutes motivated participants to shoot a mannequin in the head with an actual gun after the game was switched off. Despite the fact that the head is a considerably more difficult target to hit than the body, as a result, the conduct rewarded in the game manifested into the real world. It should be noted that these findings do not imply anything because this is a non-experimental research. They did not prove anything. They just simply relate them. That someone who plays FPS games is more likely to fire a real gun at someone or aim for their head. Exposure to FPS games, according to a risk and reliance approach from Gentile and Bushman study from 2012, is simply one of several factors that might influence individuals to aim for the head while firing a genuine gun. These findings suggest that video games have the ability to educate or improve skills such as shooting a genuine rifle. They simply concluded that they never prove anything. They just simply relate two factors. They see correlation between two variables. They never concluded anything because it's non-experimental research. And then we move on to experimental research. And this is a real hard one. The source that was used for this experimental research is from Greer and Hahn from a study from 2015. And let's get started. In the study, before we get started, let's get familiarized with this term, MTS, generalized for visual match to sample, is an essential skill for all children. It may, for example, be a requirement for learning visual discrimination and as a result, learning the names of items in the visual world. Without training, children perceive the sameness of stimuli when visual discrimination is present. The experiment aims to test if the implementation of conditioned reinforcement for 2D print stimuli results in appearance of MTS response without instructions, that is, generalized visual identity responding. Now, let's move on to the methods, what they used, what they did. Well, they chose participants, 3 5-year-old boys with autism spectrum disorders, ASD. With autism, actually, generally, we can say they had autism, took part in the experiment. Participants A, B, C were selected from a self-contained special education kindergarten, 3rd grade classroom that used CABAS, CABAS model of instruction and curriculum. The brief information about participants can be seen in table 1. They mention everything, like participant A, how he was a non-verbal activity at initial listener and pre-speaker levels. He could keep eye contact for up to 5 seconds. He was not target trained. For participant B, he could keep eye contact for up to 10 seconds, and he was toilet trained. Yeah, and could independently issue a request for toilet. Yeah, so all the information is mentioned in the table 1 here. Now let's move on to the setting. The study sessions were held entirely in the self-contained classroom. 3 huge horseshoe-shaped tables were set up in the classroom for independent or small group training. It also had 2 computer terminals on one side of the classroom and a spacious carpeted space on the other half of the classroom for peaceful reading or free play, with bookshelves, numerous educational games, blocks, puzzles, and many more than books. And now we see the materials in the research that were used: a black ink pen, a clipboard, and pre-constructed data forms were utilized in the study. During conditioning, 2D print stimuli, intervention, and pre- and post-conditioning probe sessions that confirmed the implementation of the independent variable. Several sets of 20.32 and to something centimeter size sheets, pages were containing 15 small pictures, were used with multiple exemplars across different colors, sizes, etc. that were not preferred. Prior to the start of the research, all target stimuli employed in this approach were checked to confirm that they were not favored stimuli. They were not preferred ones, okay? They were not favored, they were checked. And the figure 4 was used during probe sessions for the set stimuli. We can see here, figure 4. And for figure 5, we can see that it was used during the first phase of intervention sessions, and it contained only non-preferred stimuli. So the intervention sessions were when they were reinforcing it as an independent variable. You should understand that reinforcing these non-favorable, non-favored stimuli, they were reinforcing the use of that during these intervention sessions. And yeah, they contained only non-preferred stimuli. You can see here from figure 6, figure 5 is here, and for figure 6 shows an example of the set stimuli used during this second phase of intervention sessions that contained combined stimuli. So first of all, they were non-preferred, and in their intervention, they were reinforced to make them preferable, and then they were tested again, the children, with a figure 6 that contains a mixture of preferred and non-preferred stimuli. Just check the results again. The 77 similar visual MTS repertoires and the same 77 stimuli requiring abstractions from the CPIRK evaluation were utilized during the MTS probing sessions to identify the presence or the absence of MTS responsiveness. Table 4 here, you see this was used, that shows a set of stimuli used, and figure 7a, this one here, with the children and the teacher, shows example of identical and abstraction MTS probe sessions. These were the sessions for identical and abstraction MTS probing. Now moving on to experimental design. It was a very big experiment. It was a really well-designed one. To account for maturity and instruction, a non-current multiple probe design was used among 3 individuals from a study in Johnston and Pennypacker from 1993. The pre-experimental probes were staggered across each participant, that is, non-current multiple probes, with participant A receiving 1 probe session for each of the identical and abstraction stimuli, participant B receiving 2 probe sessions for each, and participant C receiving 3. following the installation of the independent variable for participant A. A second pre-experimental probe was conducted for participant B. At the same time, the first pre-experimental probe for participant C was carried out. Controls for short-term maturation and instructional histories were included in the design for participant B and C, as well as an instructional history for participant A. The experimental sequence is illustrated in the figure 8. We can see here. These are all the dependent variables mentioned here. The DV, DV is dependent variable. And we can see how independent variable is here, established of conditioned reinforcement for the 2D visual print. This is like established for reinforcing 2D visual print stimuli on 5 test pages. Then we can see pre-experimental probe for the independent variable here. And in the end, post-experimental probes. And there's like here, stimulus reinforcement pairing protocol. These sessions here, these are all reinforcing for the 2D visual print stimuli. And then we get the results. Now methods, again, and dependent variable. The 3 dependent variables, which were measured before and after participants looked at the stimuli pages. Look, here we have 3. 1, 2, 3, and at the end, 3 again. We measured like the change, like after the introduction of the independent variable, what were the changes to the dependent variable? Because we were reinforcing the visual print. So, which were measured before and after participants looked at the stimuli pages were established as conditioned reinforcers for looking at test pages. The first dependent was 77 matched probe trials for the emission of matched responses to similar 2D visual stimuli to identical MTS responses to the CPIRK curriculum. That is, match all upper and lowercase alphabet letters, Arabic numbers, colors, shapes, and common identical animals. The second dependent variable was the emission of accurate MTS consecutive. Like it's actually emission is kind of like response. And just conjugated answers to the category of variation, various fonts, size, and colors of the same 77 stimuli. The pre and post conditioning. The pre is before, like the dependent variables before the reinforcement was introduced, and post conditioning after reinforcing the 2D stimuli. Probe trials were made up of instructional probe trials that included reinforcement for any correct replies and corrections for any erroneous responses. In the pre and post conditioning probes, each of the 77 stimuli in the identical and abstraction probes was shown just once, before and after the condition was done. They were shown just once. The third dependent variable, the third DV, was a test for generalization, the conditioned reinforcement, and a preference for looking at books in the free play area. Identical and abstraction MTS responses. A correct MTS response was defined as glancing at 2 stimuli on the desktop, one exemplar and one non-exemplar, and placing the target print stimulus on the top of the exemplar stimulus. On the desktop, for example, 2 index cards with letters H and L were placed. After hearing the experimenter's vocal antecedent, the participant was instructed to place his index card, like H card, on top of exemplar H on the desktop within 3 seconds inter-response time. So matching letter H with H, that's all. Placing card on a non-H stimulus constituted as an incorrect response. An identical MTS response required participants to match 2 identical stimuli of the same color, shape, size, and font, like matching letter H with an identical letter H, not the same one, an identical one that like looks the same. Using 2 white index cards with a printer letter H in red using Cosmic Sounds MS More, something like just 2 different fonts of H, but like they're similar. In the presence of one irrelevant stimuli like dog, triangle, like H, there's like dog triangle. We have to match H with H because H doesn't match with dog and triangle. And the experimenter described the relevant condition like match letter H with H. That's all he's asking. Abstraction MTS responses demanded that the stimulus to be matched contain essential stimuli like such as shapes, colors, and categories such as letters, numbers, shapes, and animals with varying irrelevant characteristics of the matching stimulus, like matching dogs of different breeds, like Schnauzer to Beagle. In the presence of one non-explanatory, like triangle, you do not match different breed dog to a triangle. You match a dog to a different type of dog, cow or something, not to that. Furthermore, for abstraction letter MTS, many examples from various fonts like Cosmic Sans, Times New Roman were used. Now let's move on to observing responses for book stimuli. The researchers used continuous 65-second hold intervals during 5-minute observation to assess the applicability of conditioned reinforcement for printed pages to reinforcement for gazing at books. Prior to and after the acquisition of a conditioned reinforcement for 2D visual print, like the intervention time, when they're reinforcing the use of 2D visual print stimuli. The intervals of monitoring reactions to book stimuli as conditioned reinforcements were assessed. Researchers employed digital clocks, black pens, and data forms for their other duration measurements. Stacks of children's books on a desktop, bookcase with various novels, and many bins loaded with plush animal toys, automobiles, puzzles, animal figurines, and everything like toys in the free-to-play area. During these probing sessions, at least one of each participant's peers was present and participated in the free-to-play area. And observing response was defined as touching or making eye contact with the book, touching pictures like while looking at the book, textually responded to the letters like its letter E while looking at letter E, while looking at book or choosing other books, that is, monitoring reactions to book stimuli, included behaviors, including children viewing books, selecting books, and researching for books. This was all within observing response. Now let's move on to data collection. Data collection for independent variable and dependent variable. Participants' answers of right and wrong replies, emissions were like answers they gave, were recorded with a black pen on data sheets for all the sessions and periods of watching responses, using plus for correct responses and minus for negative responses, erroneous ones. The probe data for the intervals of accurate observing responses for book stimuli were gathered using 65-second hold interval measurements taken during 5-minute observation in free play settings and with books, toys, and other objects. Observing through the 5 whole second interval resulted in a plus, whereas not observing or not observing for entire 5-second interval resulted in a negative. Researchers also collected the data of various stages of conditioning intervention too. The SS conditioning protocol consisted of 20 training and test trials in blocks of 20. A successful pairing trial comprised of the participants constantly looking at the training pages for like 5, 10 intervals, like 15 seconds. These were the intervals that I look at like the training pages, while receiving 2 or 3 pairings of the principal reinforcers. This is the period of time, the intervention, they're like intervening with the participants to like improve, like they're reinforcing the 2D stimuli, reinforcing and viewing the stimuli. Even when time increments were necessary, pairing trials cycled 2 or 3 pairs. The training session was repeated as many times as necessary until the subjects gave the right replies for the requisite amount of time. Successful pairing trial. After everything was completed for each training trial, a test trial with no pairings was undertaken. In the test trial, a plus was recorded if the participants could answer the page for the prescribed interval, otherwise the minus was recorded. Using a line graph, the data for 20 test trials were graphed during the SS intervention sessions as the number of accurate replies to test trials. In the figure 13, we have figure 13 here. Like there's the test trial data with the non-preferred stimuli. This is the number of correct responses and the intervention sessions. You see, before intervention sessions, number of correct responses was less, but after a lot of them, it started go up, after many sessions, in blocks. And here we go next. This is ABC, participant A, B, and C, and down we have intervention sessions, and here we have number of correct responses to test trials. It goes up with increasing intervention sessions because they're reinforcing their 2D stimuli for learning. And now we look at the results of all the effort. From figure 10, here we have figure 10, we can see it depicts the number of accurate 2D identical visual print MTS answers for the pre and post-intervention probing sessions, so not including the intervention sessions based on 77 trials. During the pre-intervention probing session, participant A gave 2 accurate replies only. During the post-intervention probing session, he produced 73 correct MTS replies. You see the difference, right? Here we have interventions, right, with increasing correct responses for test trials, but just seeing the difference without intervention, we can see that this massive difference. Pre, intervention, and post-intervention, a lot of difference. That's the power of reinforcing. And now we see during the two pre-intervention probe sessions, participant B emitted 4 and 3 correct MTS responses only. And after 2D visual print stimuli was conditioned as a reinforcement for observing responses, he responded with 76 correct match responses, that is with 99% accuracy. During the post-intervention probe session, you see, is not too good before intervention, but after intervention, when the 2D visual print stimuli was reinforced, conditionally reinforced, he got way too correct with his answers, 76 correct. That's a lot of accuracy, 99%. Now for participant C, he produced 16 and 17 before pre-intervention, but post-intervention, he produced 77 accurate replies, 100% accuracy. In figure 11 and figure 10, we have in the identical MTS only, identical MTS probe sessions. For figure 11, we have abstract MTS probe sessions. Depicts the number of accurate 2D visual abstraction MTS responses given a total of 77 trials, same as figure 10. Participant A provided no accurate replies pre-intervention, but during post-intervention, he produced 73 correct replies. That's 95% accuracy, pretty good. After conditioning, the 2D visual print stimuli as a reinforcement for noticing responses. During the two pre-intervention probing sessions, participant B gave either no or 1 valid response. But during the post-intervention probing sessions, he measured 77 responses that were correct, 100% accuracy, after he was conditionally reinforced with 2D visual print stimuli. And participant C, he gave 12 correct responses pre-intervention, and post-intervention, he gave 77 accurate replies. And the findings indicate that the conditioning 2D visual print stimuli as conditioned reinforcers, this is the intervention time, they intervened, and 2D visual print stimuli was conditioned as a reinforcer and resulted in the development of 2D MTS accuracy for both identical and non-identical methods. So what did we conclude from this research? The findings show that once individuals learn to ignore non-preferred visual stimuli as conditioned reinforcement for observing responses, The visual print stimuli for their instructional programs drew their attention and resulted in the formation of generalized visual MTS responding. And the results of this study, the results of the research support the notion that the acquisition of conditioned reinforcement, like the intervention timed, where they like conditionally reinforced for 2D visual print stimuli as observing responses, may be a developmental cusp because it allowed the participants to learn things that they could not learn before. Like they're using like psychology, like operant conditioning, they're conditioning children to like reinforce their like 2D visual print stimuli, to like learn things that they could not learn before coming into direct contact with the contingencies associated with their new environment. This is like really good research. And now we move on from what we learned from the two different researches now, the differences between experimental and non-experimental research methods. It's in the definition. Experimental research is a type of research that takes scientific method to manipulating one or more independent variables and assessing their influence on the dependent variable. Just a bit different from the starting one, whereas non-experimental research does not include variable manipulation at all. For example, scientists doing an experimental research on the effect of one chemical on the others, whereas non-experimental research can be just finding out characteristics of various chemicals. That's all. Like experimental research can be like he's trying to like form a causal relationship between the like effect of one chemical on other, but whereas non-experimental research just simply just includes like finding out characteristics of various chemicals. And goal, the different goal. When the researcher has a specific research question or hypothesis about a causal relationship between two variables, and it is possible, feasible, ethical to manipulate the independent variable and randomly assign participants to conditions or orders of conditions, experimental research is the only appropriate way to go. However, non-experimental research is appropriate even when these conditions are not met. Like these above conditions, if they're not met, we can go with non-experimental research. The purpose of experimental research is to find out why something is happening, the why. But whereas in the case of non-experimental research, which is like more descriptive in character, with the final purpose of describing what is happening here, the different uses these two researches. Experimental research is mostly performed to make scientific breakthroughs in technology. Like it's for innovation and advancement in technologies, support innovation, look for solutions to world problems. Whereas non-experimental research is mostly used to describe characteristics of subjects. It's like doing for like large-scale study and compare situational studies. Experimental research method is often carefully organized, resulting in results and with few to no errors because it's like meticulously performed. Whereas non-experimental research is in creation of real-life relevant studies. Setting, where are these two studies used? They belong to different settings too. Experimental research is conducted in an artificial environment since the majority of the factors that influence the settings are controlled, whereas non-experimental research is conducted in a natural and uncontrolled environment. Well, we got a control group here, and we got to manipulate the factors, so it's kind of unnatural, so it's in experimental research. External factors are frequently tampered with during the study in experimental research. Researchers may eliminate superfluous factors in order to get a faultless and well-structured study method and findings. So it's not a natural environment. Although these factors may appear to be inconsequential at times, their eradication may have an impact on the research outcomes, like small factors, like small extraneous variables that were removed in experimental research may have like a large impact, maybe. And now the different research approach. In experimental research, the researchers aim to prove their hypothesis is correct by trying to find out and establish a cause-effect relationship between independent variable and dependent variable, while keeping extraneous extraneous variables in check. Sorry for the accent here. I don't know how that slipped out. Non-experimental research, on the other hand, aims to find out naturally occurring relationship between variables. It doesn't hope or aim to manipulate variables without statistically concluding any relationship between the variables. As we have seen in the non-experimental research case, they do not statistically conclude anything or any relationship between variables. It's on the loose ends, always. And also circumstances of use. When can these two researches be used? Non-experimental research methods like correlation research, they work well with large groups of data. Unorganized large groups of data, like in situations where they're conducting an experimental research, is like not possible at all. Like there's no like independent variable, no dependent variable. In situations like that, we use non-experimental research. Whereas experimental research requires stringent requirements, like specifically establish cause and effect relationship between variables. So they do need independent variable and dependent variable because it's like the stringent requirement here, like to establish a cause and effect relationship. Sorry, it's like way too much like speaking for the first time. And the variables control. Well, that's all. That's what we said. And that's what we approach differences. And now we're done with weird like circumstances of use. Non-experimental, large groups of data, not feasible, experimental research possible, use non-experimental research. If you want to establish a cause and effect relationship, if you see an independent variable, control groups, dependent variable, the only appropriate choice is experimental research. Well, I mentioned all the references like for the two research here, and we're done with this. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.